Welcome to my channel. Tonight's bedtime story is about a great leader, a man who led his country through its greatest trial and emerged as one of its greatest heroes. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky. His father was a simple farmer and his mother, a former slave. Though he had little formal education, Lincoln was a man of great intelligence and determination. He read voraciously and was self-educated in law. His honesty and integrity were legendary. And though he started as a poor farmer, he eventually became a successful lawyer and politician. In 1860, at the height of his career, Lincoln was elected President of the United States. His election was the beginning of the end for the institution of slavery in America. The Southern states, which relied heavily on slave labor, seceded from the Union and formed their own government. In 1861, the U.S. was plunged into a terrible civil war. As the war raged on, Lincoln grew weary. The constant fighting and loss of life were taking a toll on him, but he knew that he had to stay strong for the sake of the Union. He worked tirelessly to keep the country together and to end slavery. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate territory were to be freed. This was a turning point in the war, and Lincoln's leadership during this time was crucial. After 4 years of bloody conflict, the Union was preserved and slavery was abolished. Lincoln had led his country through its greatest trial and had emerged as one of its greatest heroes. But his victory was short-lived. Just months after the war ended, Lincoln was assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer. Though he is no longer with us, Lincoln's legacy lives on. He is remembered as a great leader, a man who stood up for what he believed in, even when it was difficult. He is a symbol of hope and freedom for people around the world. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Abraham Lincoln, the man who shaped history and inspired millions. May his story give you hope and strength as you face the challenges of your own life. Sweet dreams. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe for more relaxing bedtime stories each week. Have a peaceful night, and I'll see you next time. Early Life in Childhood, 1809-1830. In the quiet backwoods of Kentucky, on a cold winter morning, a child was born who would one day change the course of American history. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Born on February 12, 1809, in a single-room log cabin on the Sinking Spring Farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky, his beginnings were as humble as any in the story of the United States. His early life was shaped not by privilege or wealth, but by poverty, hardship, and the rugged simplicity of life on the American frontier. The Lincoln family, Abraham's father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and carpenter. He was known as a hard worker, practical and modest. Though he struggled financially for much of his life, land disputes and bad luck seemed to follow him. Still, he was respected for his honesty and determination. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle, caring, and deeply religious. She gave Abraham the tenderness and moral grounding that would guide him all his life. Abraham was very close to his mother, and her influence on his character was profound. Abraham had an older sister, Sarah, and later, a younger brother, Thomas Jr., who sadly died in infancy. The Lincoln family was not wealthy, not even comfortable. They lived from the land, raising crops, hunting game, and doing the backbreaking work necessary to survive on the frontier. Life on the frontier. The world Lincoln was born into was one of log cabins, forests, and small clearings of farmland. Life on the frontier was harsh and demanding. Families had to be self-sufficient. Every day was filled with labor, cutting wood, tending fields, caring for animals, repairing tools. He helped with chores from an early age, carrying water, splitting logs, and learning the rhythms of survival. Education was scarce. Frontier schools were small, often just one room, with irregular schedules depending on the season. Teachers were not always well trained, and books were few, but Lincoln had a hunger to learn. Even with less than a year of formal schooling in his entire childhood, he taught himself to read and write. A love of reading. Abraham was curious by nature. He would often walk miles to borrow a book. Some of the works that shaped his young mind included the Bible, Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and the biography of George Washington. He read slowly, carefully, often by the light of the fire at night. His stepmother would later recall finding him stretched out on the floor, a book in hand, the fire flickering as his eyes scanned the pages. Unlike many boys his age, he was less interested in hunting or rough play. Instead, he preferred stories, reflection, and conversation. He also practiced writing, using charcoal or chalk on wooden boards when paper was scarce. This habit of self-education, of learning outside of school, driven by his own curiosity, would stay with him his entire life. The first great loss, his mother. When Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. In October 1818, his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, fell ill with what was known as milk sickness. It was a deadly disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten poisonous plants. Nancy's death devastated young Abraham. He later said that he never truly got over the loss. She had been his emotional anchor, the one who nurtured his sense of right and wrong. Her absence left a deep hole in his heart. For a time, the Lincoln children and their father lived in grief and hardship. The home felt empty without Nancy's warmth. A new mother, Sarah Bush Johnston, in 1819, Thomas Lincoln remarried. His new wife was Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with children of her own. Sarah recognized his thirst for knowledge and encouraged his reading. She provided him with books when she could and supported his ambitions, even if they seemed unusual for a farm boy. Later in life, Lincoln would say that he owed much of what he became to his stepmother. This new bond helped heal the wounds of his mother's death and gave him the confidence to keep learning and growing. Moving to Indiana around the same time, the Lincolns moved from Kentucky to Indiana, partly because of land disputes and the uncertainty of property titles in Kentucky. The journey was difficult, crossing rivers, hauling possessions, carving out a new life in the wilderness. In Indiana, life was still hard. The family lived in a crude log shelter before Thomas built a more permanent cabin. Abraham continued to help with farm work, splitting rails, planting crops, and building fences. His tall, lean frame, he would eventually grow to be over 6 feet 4 inches, was well suited to physical labor. But even in the midst of work, his mind wandered to books, stories, and ideas beyond the frontier. The young storyteller, those who knew Abraham as a boy, recalled his sense of humor and gift for storytelling. Around the fire, he would entertain friends and neighbors with jokes, tales, and imitations. His memory was sharp, and he had a way of holding people's attention. This talent for speaking, natural, engaging, sprinkled with humor, would later become one of his greatest tools as a lawyer and politician. Even then, people noticed something unusual about him. Though poor and unpolished, Abraham seemed to carry within him a spark of something greater. The death of his sister in 1828, when Abraham was 19, his sister Sarah died while giving birth. It was another devastating loss for him. Having already lost his mother, this second family tragedy deepened his sense of grief and the fragility of life. These experiences of loss, combined with the hardships of frontier living, gave Lincoln a seriousness, a depth of character, and a sympathy for human suffering that would define him as a leader. Leaving home, by his late teens, Lincoln was restless. He took jobs outside the family farm, including working on flatboats down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. These trips exposed him to the wider world beyond the frontier. It was in New Orleans that Lincoln is believed to have first witnessed slavery up close. Men and women chained, bought, and sold in the markets. The sight left a deep impression on him. Though he was not yet an abolitionist, the seeds of his hatred for slavery were planted. At age 21, Lincoln left his father's home for good. He moved to Illinois, where he would begin the next chapter of his life, carving out a career for himself, first as a worker and later as a lawyer. Reflection: the making of a character. Looking back on Lincoln's childhood, it is remarkable how little he had, and yet how much he gained. He had almost no formal schooling, but he taught himself to be a thinker. He faced loss and grief, but those struggles gave him compassion. He was born poor, but he built within himself the richness of knowledge and moral strength. The boy who read by firelight in a log cabin was preparing himself without knowing it, for the greatest challenges any American president would ever face. The young politician, 1830 to 1849. Abraham Lincoln's story in Illinois begins like so many others in early America, with movement, change, and the pursuit of a better life. In 1830, when Lincoln was 21 years old, his father, Thomas Lincoln, decided to uproot the family once again. This time, they moved westward from Indiana into Illinois. The family settled in Macon County, near Decatur, on a small patch of land. Illinois in the 1830s was rough, swampy, and filled with wild prairie grass. Life was hard, but Lincoln was young, strong, and unusually tall already, reaching over 6 feet. He gained a reputation for his physical strength. Neighbors told stories of his ability to split logs, carry heavy loads, and outwork most men. His towering height, combined with his long limbs, made him look awkward, but people admired his work ethic. It was this physical labor that earned him the nickname the Rail Splitter, a symbol that would later become a powerful part of his political image. Leaving the family farm despite his strength, Lincoln was restless. His relationship with his father was strained. Thomas had little education, distrusted books, and valued hard manual labor above all else. Abraham, on the other hand, hungered for knowledge. He wanted something more than farm work. Soon after arriving in Illinois, he decided to strike out on his own. Lincoln left the family farm and began working a series of jobs to support himself. One of his first was helping build flatboats to carry goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. On one of these trips in 1831, Lincoln is said to have witnessed the brutal reality of slavery up close. In New Orleans, he saw enslaved men and women being bought and sold at markets. Some accounts suggest that this experience left a deep impression on him, planting early seeds of his hatred for slavery, though. At this stage, he wasn't yet an abolitionist. New Salem years 1831-1837. After his river adventures, Lincoln settled in the small village of New Salem, Illinois, a frontier community with only a few dozen families. Here, his character began to take shape in the eyes of others. In New Salem, Lincoln tried his hand at nearly everything. He worked as a store clerk, helped operate a mill, and even became a postmaster. He also earned a reputation for honesty. One famous story tells how, after realizing he had given a customer the wrong change, he walked miles to return just a few pennies. This earned him the nickname Honest Abe, a title that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was also remembered for his storytelling. Around the fire, or in the store, he entertained neighbors with jokes, tall tales, and witty observations. People liked him. He was awkward, yes, but his humor and sincerity drew people in. It was in New Salem that Lincoln first developed a serious interest in politics. He read newspapers, debated issues of the day, and joined a local debating society where he sharpened his ability to argue and persuade. He had almost no formal schooling, but he read constantly. He borrowed books on law, history, and government. By the light of a fireplace or a candle, he taught himself. The Black Hawk War, 1832. In 1832, Lincoln briefly served in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War, a conflict between the United States and Native Americans led by the Sauk leader Black Hawk. Lincoln was elected captain of his company by the men who served with him, even though he had no military experience. He later admitted he saw no real combat, but he took pride in the fact that his fellow volunteers had trusted him with leadership. First political defeat, 1832. That same year, at just 23 years old, Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature. His platform was focused on improving local infrastructure, better roads, canals, and schools. But he was unknown outside of New Salem, and though he received strong support locally, he lost the election. Still, the experience didn't discourage him. It was his first taste of politics, and he would not give it up easily. A new career. Law and politics. Lincoln tried business next. With a partner, he bought a small general store. Unfortunately, the venture failed, leaving him in debt, so large he jokingly called it his national debt. He spent years paying it off, but his honesty and determination to settle every cent only strengthened his reputation. Meanwhile, His interest in law grew. He borrowed law books and studied them tirelessly. Without attending law school, Lincoln managed to pass the bar exam in 1836. By 1837, he had moved to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital, where he began practicing as a lawyer. Lincoln's law career was unusual. He wasn't flashy or eloquent in court, but he was logical, clear, and persuasive. He became known for his ability to simplify complex issues and connect with juries. His reputation for fairness and integrity attracted clients, and his practice steadily grew. Return to politics. 1834 to 1842. In 1834, Lincoln tried politics again, running for the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. This time, he won. He would serve 4 terms in the Illinois House of Representatives from 1834 to 1842. As a state legislator, Lincoln supported policies that promoted economic development. He favored banks, canals, railroads, and education ideas that matched the Whig vision of progress. During these years, Lincoln also developed a strong belief in the power of free labor. He believed that every man should have the opportunity to rise through hard work, just as he had risen from poverty. A difficult love life. During his time in Springfield, Lincoln also experienced struggles in his personal life. In the 1830s, he became close to Anne Rutledge, a young woman in New Salem. Many accounts suggest they were deeply in love and possibly even engaged. Tragically, Anne died in 1835, likely of typhoid fever. Lincoln was devastated. Friends worried about his mental state, describing him as depressed and withdrawn for months afterward. This loss haunted him for years. Later, in Springfield, Lincoln courted Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Their relationship was turbulent. They broke off their engagement once, but eventually reunited. In 1842, Lincoln and Mary Todd married. The marriage was not always easy. Mary was strong-willed, ambitious, and emotional, while Lincoln was quiet and brooding. Yet the union would shape his political career and personal life for decades. Congressional years, 1847 to 1849. Lincoln's political ambitions soon reached beyond Illinois. In 1846, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Whig. In Washington, he served a single 2-year term from 1847 to 1849 in Congress. Lincoln was not a leading figure, but he made his mark. He opposed the Mexican-American War, arguing that President James K. Polk had provoked it unjustly. This stance was controversial, especially since the war was popular at the time, and it cost him political support back home. Lincoln also spoke against the expansion of slavery, though his position was cautious. He believed slavery was wrong, but did not yet call for its immediate abolition. Instead, he opposed its spread into new territories. This moderate stance reflected both his moral beliefs and his awareness of the political realities of the time. By 1849, Lincoln's term in Congress had ended, and he returned to Springfield to focus on his law practice. For the next several years, he would step back from national politics, building his legal career and supporting his family. But beneath the surface, the great conflicts that would define his presidency, slavery, sectional tension, and the future of the Union, were growing stronger every year. The road to leadership, 1850 to 1860. The middle of the 19th century was a turbulent time in America. The nation was growing rapidly. New states, new territories, and new opportunities, but also new conflicts. At the center of nearly every major debate was the burning question: would slavery expand into the new territories, or would it be contained? Abraham Lincoln, who had spent the 1840s stepping back from national politics after a brief stint in Congress, could not stay silent forever. The 1850s would draw him back into the public arena, push him into the heart of the nation's greatest moral crisis, and prepare him for the presidency. Lincoln after Congress, 1852-1854. Lincoln's time in Congress in the late 1840s had not been particularly glorious. He had spoken out against the Mexican-American War, an unpopular stance in his district, and he chose not to run for re-election. Returning to Illinois, he resumed his law practice in Springfield with renewed focus. These years were steady, even quiet. Lincoln became one of the state's leading lawyers. He traveled the 8th Judicial Circuit, riding on horseback from county to county, handling cases that ranged from property disputes to criminal trials. His reputation grew. He was fair, sharp-witted, and could charm juries with homespun stories and logical arguments. Yet, beneath his professional success, Lincoln was restless. He followed politics closely. His moral opposition to slavery, though often carefully worded, never disappeared. And in 1854, a single piece of legislation would reignite his political ambitions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the return to politics in 1854. Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, a skilled and ambitious politician, introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law effectively overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery north of a certain line. Instead, it allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether slavery would be pursued, a concept called popular sovereignty. The law outraged many in the North, including Lincoln. To him, it was not just a political maneuver, but a moral threat. He believed slavery was wrong, deeply wrong, and though he was cautious about calling for immediate abolition where slavery already existed, he strongly opposed its expansion. Lincoln gave speech after speech denouncing the act. His words were simple but powerful. If slavery was wrong, how could the nation allow it to spread? He argued that the Founding Fathers had intended for slavery to be placed on the path to eventual extinction, not expansion. These speeches propelled Lincoln back into politics. He ran for the U.S. Senate in 1855, but lost. Still, the campaign gave him visibility. He was becoming known not just as a lawyer, but as a principled voice against the spread of slavery. The rise of the Republican Party. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also transformed the political landscape. The old Whig Party, which Lincoln had long belonged to, collapsed under the pressure of the slavery issue. In its place rose a new coalition, the Republican Party. This new party was dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery into the territories. It attracted former Whigs like Lincoln, disillusioned Democrats, Free Soilers, and abolitionists. By the late 1850s, the Republican Party was gaining strength across the North. Lincoln joined the Republicans early, and his skill as a speaker made him a natural leader. He was not a fiery radical, but a careful, reasoned voice who could appeal to moderates while still making a strong moral case against slavery. The Lincoln-Douglas debates 1858. Lincoln's most famous political moment of the decade came in 1858, when he once again ran for the U.S. Senate, this time directly against Stephen A. Douglas, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The campaign produced the legendary Lincoln-Douglas debates, a series of 7 face-to-face debates across Illinois, drawing massive crowds. The two men could not have been more different in style or substance. Douglas, short and fiery, was an experienced politician, confident and combative. Lincoln, tall and deliberate, relied on logic, moral reasoning, and plain-spoken clarity. The debates centered almost entirely on slavery and its expansion. Lincoln argued that the nation could not survive half-slave and half-free. In his famous words, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Douglas, on the other hand, defended popular sovereignty, claiming that each state and territory should decide for itself. Though Lincoln ultimately lost the Senate race, the Illinois legislature, which chose senators at the time, favored Douglas. The debates catapulted Lincoln onto the national stage. Newspapers across the country reprinted his words. Suddenly, he was not just an Illinois lawyer, he was a rising national figure in the fight over slavery. The Cooper Union Speech, 1860. By 1860, Lincoln was being seriously considered as a Republican candidate for president. To build credibility, he needed to prove himself outside Illinois. In February 1860, he delivered a speech at Cooper Union in New York City. It was a masterpiece of logic and persuasion. He carefully demonstrated, using historical evidence, that the Founding Fathers had opposed the expansion of slavery. The speech reassured skeptics in the East that Lincoln was not just a backwoods politician, but a thoughtful, capable leader. Newspaper editor Horace Greeley wrote approvingly of him. The speech electrified Republican circles. Lincoln had arrived on the national stage. The road to the presidency, as the 1860 Republican National Convention approached, Lincoln was a serious contender, but not the runner. Other candidates, like William H. Seward of New York, were more prominent, but Lincoln's reputation as a moderate firmly opposed to slavery's expansion, but not seen as a radical abolitionist, made him an attractive choice. At the convention in Chicago, Lincoln's supporters worked tirelessly. On the third ballot, Lincoln secured the nomination. The rail splitter from Illinois, born in a log cabin, almost entirely and once dismissed as a country lawyer, was now the Republican candidate for President of the United States. The nation stood on the edge of crisis, and Lincoln was about to step into history. The election of 1860 and secession crisis by the late 1850s. Abraham Lincoln had become more than a regional politician. He was no longer just the self-taught lawyer from Illinois or the folksy debater who had tangled with Stephen Douglas. Instead, he was now a man whose speeches carried weight across the nation. His name had begun to appear in newspapers from Boston to New Orleans. For many Americans, he represented something new and untested, a leader from outside the traditional centers of power. But to understand the drama of the election of 1860, we first need to remember the atmosphere of the United States at that time. The country was not merely divided, it was unraveling. The conflict between North and South had reached a fever pitch. The debate over slavery was no longer just an issue of moral argument. It was shaping elections, tearing apart friendships, and even leading to violence on the floor of Congress. The infamous Bleeding Kansas conflict, the caning of Senator Charles Sumner, and the rise of militant abolitionists like John Brown made it clear that the United States stood at the edge of something catastrophic. The political landscape before 1860, in the years leading up to the election, the old party system had collapsed. For decades, the two major parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, had managed to keep the nation together, often through compromise. But compromises could only go so far when the moral and economic foundations of the two regions were pulling apart. The Whig Party had disintegrated, its leaders unable to satisfy both Northern opposition to slavery and Southern demands for its expansion. Out of this chaos, the Republican Party had risen a new coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats. The party was young, but it was energized, and Lincoln was among its brightest stars. The Democrats, meanwhile, were fracturing. Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, promoted the idea of popular sovereignty, that each territory should decide for itself whether to allow slavery. Southern Democrats, however, rejected even this. They insisted that slavery be allowed to spread freely into the territories. The division was so deep that by 1860, the Democrats would split into two competing factions. Lincoln's nomination, the Republican National Convention of 1860, took place in Chicago, in a great wooden hall built specifically for the event. Lincoln was not the many expected William H. Seward of New York, a longtime senator and prominent abolitionist, to claim the nomination. Seward was respected, eloquent, and experienced, but he was also polarizing. Lincoln's strength lay in being a compromise candidate. He was firmly opposed to the expansion of slavery, but he was not as radical as Seward. He was a Westerner, which made him appealing to the rapidly growing states beyond the Mississippi. His reputation as an honest, plain-speaking man worked in his favor. When the ballots were cast, Lincoln gradually gained ground. By the third ballot, he secured the nomination. Outside the convention hall, Chicago erupted with celebration. Word traveled quickly by telegraph, and soon Lincoln's name was known nationwide as the Republican candidate for president. The four-way race, the election of 1860, was unlike any in American history. Instead of two major candidates, there were four. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, representing a party opposed to the expansion of slavery into the territories. Stephen A. Douglas, the Northern Democrat, advocating popular sovereignty. John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, demanding protection for slavery everywhere. John Bell, candidate of the Constitutional Union Party, who sought to ignore the slavery issue and preserve the Union by compromise. The division of the Democratic Party worked in Lincoln's favor. He did not even appear on the ballot in many Southern states, but in the North, where the majority of the population lived, he gained overwhelming support. Lincoln's victory on November 6, 1860. Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He won with less than 40% of the popular vote, but because of a fractured opposition, he secured a decisive victory in the Electoral College. The news struck like an earthquake across the South. For many white Southerners, Lincoln's election was proof that their way of life was under attack. Even though Lincoln had repeatedly said he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion was unacceptable to them. They feared it was only a matter of time before slavery itself would be threatened. Secession begins before Lincoln could even take office. The South began to secede. South Carolina led the way, declaring on December 20, 1860, that it was leaving the Union. One by one, other states followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1861, representatives from these states had met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and former U.S. Secretary of War, as their president. Lincoln had not yet been inaugurated, but already the country he was about to lead was tearing apart. Lincoln's journey to Washington. Lincoln's trip from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. in February 1861 was one of the most remarkable journeys in American political history. He traveled by train, stopping in cities and towns along the way. Crowds gathered to see him, to hear his words, to look upon the tall, solemn man who was about to face the greatest crisis in the nation's history. In Philadelphia, at Independence Hall, Lincoln gave one of his most heartfelt speeches. He declared that he would rather be assassinated than abandon the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Those words were prophetic. There were whispers of danger everywhere. In Baltimore, detectives uncovered a plot to assassinate Lincoln as he passed through the city. As a result, his train made a secret detour, and he arrived in Washington under cover of darkness. The president-elect entered the Capitol quietly, but the sense of danger hung heavy in the air, the nation on the edge. By the time Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded. The new president faced an impossible situation. Could he preserve the Union without plunging the nation into war? Could compromise still be found? Or was America destined for bloodshed? Lincoln's inaugural address was a careful balance of firmness and conciliation. He assured the South that he had no intention of ending slavery where it already existed. Yet, he insisted that secession was illegal, that the Union was perpetual, and that he would fulfill his duty to preserve it. With calm but firm words, Lincoln declared, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." It was a plea for peace, for patience, for the Union to endure. But even as Lincoln spoke, the cannons of war were being readied. The Civil War begins 1861 to 1862, when Abraham Lincoln placed his hand upon the Bible on March 4, 1861, and swore the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States. The nation was already fractured. 7 Southern states had declared secession before he even stepped foot in the White House. Their banners of independence were raised. Their leaders spoke of forming a new nation, one built on the preservation of slavery and states' rights. Lincoln entered office under no illusions. His presidency would not be a tranquil one. Yet, the reality of what was to come, the bloodshed, the devastation, and the sheer scale of the conflict was beyond even his imagining. Lincoln's inaugural address, Lincoln's inaugural speech, was not one of fiery partisanship, nor of vengeful rhetoric. Instead, it was measured, conciliatory, and calm. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, hoping to ease Southern fears. At the same time, he made it clear that secession was legally void and that the Union was perpetual. One of his most quoted lines from this address was, "We are not enemies, but friends." We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. These words were spoken with sincerity. Yet the reality on the ground was far more dangerous. The Confederacy had already seized federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses across the South. Only a few strongholds remained under Union control. The Fort Sumter crisis, the true test, came almost immediately with Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. This fortress remained under U.S. Army command, but its supplies were dwindling. To abandon the fort would mean admitting the Confederacy's legitimacy. To resupply it would risk war. Lincoln faced an agonizing decision. He understood the stakes. If he acted too aggressively, the border states Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri might join the Confederacy. Yet, to do nothing would make him appear weak. Lincoln chose a middle course. He informed South Carolina authorities that he was sending ships to deliver food, not weapons or reinforcements. The Confederates, determined to assert sovereignty, chose war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours until Union Major Robert Anderson surrendered. Not a single life was lost in the fighting, but the psychological impact was immense. The war had begun. The call to arms, Lincoln's response was swift and decisive. On April 15th, he issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days, believing that a show of national resolve could put down the rebellion quickly. To the north, the response was overwhelming. Men poured into recruiting offices, towns held patriotic rallies, and the Union cause was filled with youthful enthusiasm. But in the South, Lincoln's call was viewed as an act of aggression. For more, states Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina ceded and joined the Confederacy. Richmond, Virginia, became the Confederate capital. The line was drawn. Brothers would fight brothers, neighbors against neighbors. The Civil War had officially engulfed the nation. Struggles of a wartime president for Lincoln, the early months of war were chaotic. He had little military experience himself, yet as commander-in-chief, he was forced to make critical decisions. He spent long hours studying books on strategy, meeting with generals, and absorbing every detail of troop movements. He also faced tremendous political pressure. Radical Republicans pushed him toward immediate emancipation, while border states demanded restraint. Some Northerners even urged compromise with the Confederacy. Lincoln had to balance all sides while holding the Union together. The task was made harder by the behavior of his generals. General George B. McClellan, a young and ambitious officer, was placed in charge of the Army of the Potomac. He was brilliant in organization, but excessively cautious in action. Lincoln grew frustrated at McClellan's constant delays and his reluctance to move against Confederate forces. The First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, the war's first major land battle, took place in July 1861, near Manassas, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. Many Northerners believed it would be a quick and easy victory. Civilians even packed picnic baskets and rode out to watch. But reality was cruel. The Union Army advanced confidently at first, but Confederate reinforcements, led by General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, turned the tide. Union troops panicked and fled in a chaotic retreat back to Washington. The shock was profound. Lincoln realized this would not be a short war. The Confederacy was determined, and the Union would need far more than 90-day volunteers. Expanding presidential powers in the aftermath, Lincoln took bold measures. He expanded the size of the Army and Navy without waiting for Congress, suspended habeas corpus in certain areas to silence Confederate sympathizers, and authorized spending beyond approved limits. Critics accused him of acting like a dictator, but Lincoln defended his actions. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? For Lincoln, preserving the Union was paramount even if it meant bending constitutional boundaries. The Western theater and the rise of Grant, while the East saw stalemate, the West brought early Union success. In early 1862, Ulysses S. Grant, a relatively unknown general, captured Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee. His demand for unconditional and immediate surrender made him a Northern hero. At Shiloh, in April 1862, Grant's army suffered enormous casualties but held the field. The battle was brutal, with over 23,000 dead or wounded, proof that this war would be unlike any America had ever fought. Lincoln saw in Grant a man of determination. Despite criticism of Grant's heavy losses, Lincoln defended him. "I can't spare this man, he fights." This simple sentence revealed Lincoln's understanding. Victory required men willing to act, not just plan. Naval blockades and new technologies. Lincoln also oversaw the Union blockade of southern ports, an effort to choke the Confederacy's economy. This Anaconda Plan aimed to slowly suffocate the South by cutting off supplies and trade. The war also introduced new technologies. The clash of ironclads, the Union SUSS Monitor and the Confederacy SCSS Virginia, changed naval warfare forever. Railroads, telegraphs, and rifled muskets all gave the conflict a modern character that Lincoln had to manage with foresight. Lincoln's growing role as Commander-in-Chief by the end of 1862. Lincoln was no longer just a cautious leader trying to preserve the peace. He had grown into his wartime role, learning strategy, managing generals, and keeping the Union cause alive in the face of defeat and doubt. Still, the war's outcome remained uncertain. Confederate armies had won several key victories. Foreign recognition of the Confederacy remained a threat, and the question of slavery, whether it would be preserved, restricted, or destroyed, loomed ever larger. Lincoln was evolving too. In private, he began to see the war not only as a fight for Union, but also as a chance to end slavery once and for all. That transformation would define the next chapter of his presidency. Emancipation and Transformation, 1862 to 1863. The year was 1862, and Abraham Lincoln stood at the crossroads of war and history. The conflict that had begun as a struggle to preserve the Union was dragging on, bloodier and more divisive than anyone had anticipated. Thousands of young men were already buried, battlefields like Shiloh and Antietam soaked in blood. And though the Union had more men, more money, and more industrial might, victory remained elusive. Lincoln, sitting in the White House, felt the crushing weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Each day he read casualty reports, saw mothers arriving with letters begging for news of their sons, and listened to generals arguing over strategy. And still, he sensed something deeper. The war was not just about politics or territory. At its heart, it was about freedom. The growing question of slavery. From the very beginning, Lincoln had been careful. He had said time and again that his goal was to save the Union, not necessarily to end slavery. He knew that for slaveholding states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware had remained loyal to the Union. If he moved too fast, too openly against slavery, he might push those states into the arms of the Confederacy. But events on the ground were already forcing the issue. Enslaved men and women were fleeing plantations, slipping across Union lines in search of safety. Union generals were left wondering, what should be done with these escapees? Were they to be returned as property under old laws or treated as free? Congress had already passed the Confiscation Acts, declaring that enslaved people used to aid the Confederate war effort could be seized and freed. This was a step forward, but Lincoln began to feel that half measures weren't enough. The war would drag on endlessly unless the Union attacked not just Confederate armies, but the very institution that gave them strength. Lincoln's moral and political struggle. Lincoln wrestled with the question in private. Personally, he despised slavery. He had always believed it was a moral evil. Yet, as president, he had sworn to uphold the Constitution, and he feared moving too boldly might fracture the country beyond repair. In the summer of 1862, Lincoln confided in his cabinet that he had drafted a proclamation of emancipation. It was a radical idea, declaring freedom for millions of enslaved people in Confederate territory. Some cabinet members were stunned. Others warned against it. Secretary of State William Seward advised waiting for a Union military victory before making such an announcement, lest it seem like an act of desperation. Lincoln agreed. He placed the document in a drawer, waiting for the right moment, the turning point. Antietam. That moment came in September 1862, on the fields near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had carried the war into Union territory, hoping to win a decisive victory that might bring foreign recognition from Britain or France. But the Union Army, under General George McClellan, met him at Antietam. The battle that followed was the single bloodiest day in American history. More than 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Though tactically indecisive, Lee's retreat gave Lincoln the opening he needed. The Union could claim a victory, however narrow. Just 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln unveiled his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He declared that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the states still in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Reaction to the proclamation. The announcement shook the nation. Abolitionists rejoiced, though some criticized Lincoln for not going far enough. The proclamation did not free enslaved people in the loyal border states, only those in Confederate-controlled areas. But Lincoln's purpose was clear: weaken the rebellion while keeping the Union coalition intact. In the South, the proclamation was seen as a direct threat to their way of life. Proof that the war was not just about politics, but about the survival of slavery itself. Confederate leaders raged. In the North, opinions were mixed. Some soldiers celebrated the moral clarity of the decision, while others grumbled that they had signed up to fight for the Union, not for emancipation. Lincoln knew he risked losing political support, but he believed the course was right. A new purpose for the war. On January 1, 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Lincoln signed the document with a steady hand, declaring millions of enslaved people free. Although its practical power was limited, freedom could only be enforced where Union armies advanced. Its symbolic weight was immense. The Civil War had now become a war of liberation. The Union was no longer fighting simply to restore its boundaries, but to redefine itself around freedom. Lincoln himself said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." The Gettysburg Address. The transformation continued later that year at Gettysburg. After 3 days of brutal fighting in July 1863, the Union emerged victorious, repelling Lee's invasion of the North. In November, Lincoln traveled to the battlefield to dedicate a national cemetery. The speech he gave was brief, barely 2 minutes long, but it captured the essence of the war. He reminded Americans that their nation had been founded on liberty and equality. He urged them to see the struggle not just as a political contest, but as a test of whether government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address became one of the most famous speeches in history. It was poetic, humble, and deeply moral, and it redefined what the United States was fighting for. Lincoln's transformation. By the end of 1863, Abraham Lincoln was no longer simply the cautious lawyer from Illinois who had campaigned on halting slavery spread. He had become the great emancipator, a leader who reshaped the Union's mission and gave moral power to its cause. The war raged on, but its purpose was clear. The United States would not only survive, it would be reborn. Toward victory. 1864-1865. By the start of 1864, the American Civil War had been raging for nearly 3 years. Hundreds of thousands were dead or wounded. Entire towns and farmlands lay in ruin. Families were divided, and the country seemed caught in an endless nightmare. For Abraham Lincoln, the burden was heavier than ever. He had kept the Union together, redefined the war through emancipation, and given new meaning to the cause. But victory remained out of reach. The Confederacy, though battered, was still fighting fiercely. Many Northerners were exhausted and bitter. They wanted peace, even if it meant compromise. Lincoln knew that 1864 would be decisive, not only on the battlefield, but at the ballot box. The struggle of leadership. Lincoln had grown into his role as a war president, but his cabinet was still a mix of rivals, critics, and allies. Some generals frustrated him with their caution, others with reckless ambition. He cycled through commanders, searching for the one who could finally bring the Confederacy to its knees. In early 1864, he placed his faith in a man who had already made his mark in the West, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant takes command. Grant was not polished, nor particularly charismatic. Critics called him a drunkard, a butcher, too rough for high command. But Lincoln saw in him what the Union needed: determination. Grant was not afraid of casualties, and he did not retreat after setbacks. He fought until the enemy broke. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. The strategy shifted. Instead of chasing Confederate forces piecemeal, Grant coordinated multiple offensives across the South. His plan applied constant pressure until the Confederacy had no strength left. The Wilderness and the bloody campaigns that spring, Grant marched with the Army of the Potomac into Virginia. What followed was a brutal series of battles. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand, and casualties soared. At Cold Harbor, thousands of Union soldiers were cut down in a matter of minutes. Critics accused Grant of being reckless, of wasting lives. But unlike his predecessors, he refused to retreat. Each battle, bloody as it was, pushed the Confederates closer to exhaustion. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman advanced through Georgia, capturing Atlanta in September 1864. Sherman's success electrified the North and proved that Lincoln's war strategy was working. Lincoln's re-election battle politically. Lincoln's situation had been dire. By summer 1864, many believed he would lose his bid for re-election. Northern morale was low, casualties were high, and peace seemed far away. His critics called him a tyrant, mocking his suspension of habeas corpus and his heavy-handed use of presidential power. The Democratic candidate, General George B. McClellan, whom Lincoln had once fired, promised to negotiate peace with the Confederacy. Many feared that meant accepting Southern independence and allowing slavery to survive. But then came Sherman's victory at Atlanta. Suddenly, the tide shifted. Northerners began to believe again that the war could be won. Lincoln's message of perseverance resonated. In November 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected with a decisive majority, carrying 22 of 25 states. For the first time in American history, a nation at war re-elected its leader. The 13th Amendment with victory seeming closer, Lincoln pushed for a final, monumental goal: the abolition of slavery once and for all. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed millions, but it was a wartime measure, limited in scope. True freedom required an amendment to the Constitution. In early 1865, after fierce debate in Congress, the 13th Amendment passed. It declared, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States." Lincoln was overjoyed. As lawmakers celebrated, he quietly said, "This amendment is a king's cure for all the evils." For him, the cause of freedom was no longer a temporary proclamation, but a permanent foundation of American law. Sherman's march and the collapse of the Confederacy. While Lincoln pushed for freedom in Washington, the Union armies tore through the South. Sherman's march to the sea devastated Georgia, breaking the Confederacy's spirit. Railroads, factories, and farms were destroyed. The South, already starving, was brought to its knees. By early 1865, Confederate forces were dwindling. Robert E. Lee's army, once proud and feared, was outnumbered, undersupplied, and surrounded. The end draws near. In April 1865, Grant's forces finally broke through at Petersburg, forcing Lee to abandon Richmond, the Confederate capital. As Union troops entered the city, Lincoln himself walked its streets, cheered by newly freed black citizens who hailed him as their savior. Just days later, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The war was over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery was abolished. Lincoln's vision for America, a united nation, free of bondage, had been achieved. But for Lincoln himself, the story was not yet finished. His greatest triumph was followed almost immediately by his greatest tragedy. The assassination and aftermath, April 1865. The spring of 1865 was full of both triumph and exhaustion. After 4 long years, the Civil War was finally drawing to an end. Richmond, the Confederate capital, had fallen. Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. For Abraham Lincoln, it was a moment of deep relief. He had seen the nation through its darkest trial. The Union was preserved. Slavery had been abolished in law. Yet, Lincoln knew the work was not finished. He spoke of healing, not vengeance. With malice toward none, with charity for all. He had said in his second inaugural address just weeks earlier. It was his guiding principle as he looked toward Reconstruction. But while Lincoln dreamed of peace, others dreamed of revenge. A nation in celebration. In Washington, the mood was electric. Crowds cheered in the streets. Flags flew everywhere. Soldiers, weary from war, embraced civilians. Black Americans, free at last, celebrated their deliverance. Many called Lincoln Father Abraham, a figure of almost biblical reverence. Lincoln, however, remained modest. He took carriage rides with Mary, visited the wounded, and spent long hours meeting with generals and congressmen about rebuilding the South. He wanted reconciliation, not punishment. He hoped to welcome the Confederate States back into the Union quickly, avoiding bitterness. But for some diehards, his vision was intolerable. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin among those who despised Lincoln, was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and passionate Confederate sympathizer. Handsome, charming, and well-known on stage, Booth lived a double life, adored by audiences, but consumed by hatred for Lincoln and emancipation. Booth believed Lincoln was a tyrant who had destroyed the South. He wanted revenge, and he plotted with conspirators to strike at the very heart of the Union government. At first, Booth considered kidnapping Lincoln, but as the Confederacy collapsed, his scheme grew darker. He decided Lincoln must die, along with other Union leaders. April 14, 1865. Good Friday. That Friday was unusually warm in Washington. Lincoln rose early, meeting with his cabinet. He spoke with General Grant about post-war plans. Later, he shared a carriage ride with Mary. She noticed he seemed unusually cheerful, almost at peace. Lincoln confessed he had strange dreams lately, dreams of a ship sailing swiftly toward a distant shore. Some would later see this as a haunting foreshadowing. That evening, the Lincolns were invited to Ford's Theater to see a comedy, Our American Cousin. The play promised laughter, and after years of sorrow, Lincoln welcomed the chance for a light-hearted night. The theater, at 8:30 p.m., Abraham and Mary Lincoln arrived at Ford's Theater, joined by Major Henry Rathbone and his Clara Harris. The audience erupted in applause as the president entered. Lincoln smiled and bowed, settling into the presidential box draped with flags. The play began, and laughter filled the house. For a moment, Lincoln seemed like any other man, a husband enjoying a night out with his wife, relieved of the burdens of war. But behind the scenes, John Wilkes Booth moved silently. He knew the theater well. He had performed there many times. Carrying a small Derringer pistol and a dagger, he slipped into the building unnoticed. The fatal shot around 10:15 p.m. As the play reached a moment of laughter, Booth crept into the presidential box. With a swift motion, he raised his pistol and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Chaos erupted. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone leaped to his feet, struggling with Booth, who slashed him with a dagger before leaping over the balcony onto the stage. Booth landed awkwardly, breaking his leg, but he rose and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for thus always to tyrants. He fled into the night on horseback, vanishing into the darkness. The long night, Lincoln slumped forward, unconscious. Doctors rushed to his side but knew at once the wound was fatal. Not wanting him to die in the theater, soldiers carried him across the street to a small boarding house, the Peterson House, his body stretched diagonally, his face pale, his breathing shallow. All night, cabinet members, generals, and friends gathered in hushed silence. Mary Lincoln wept uncontrollably. Outside, crowds formed, holding candles, waiting anxiously. At 7:22 a.m., On April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, overcome with grief, whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." A nation in mourning. The news spread like wildfire. Bells tolled in every city. People sobbed in the streets. For many, it was as if a father had died. Black Americans mourned especially deeply. In Lincoln, they had seen the man who gave them freedom. Crowds of freedmen gathered in prayer, singing hymns of sorrow and gratitude. Lincoln's body lay in state in the Capitol. Thousands passed by, many waiting for hours just to glimpse their fallen leader. His funeral train carried him across the nation, retracing the path he had once taken to Washington as president-elect. Millions lined the tracks, grieving, waving flags, and laying flowers. Booth's fate, John Wilkes Booth, fled south, hiding in forests and barns, aided by Confederate sympathizers. For 12 days, he evaded capture, but Union soldiers finally cornered him in a Virginia barn. His dream of becoming a Southern hero never materialized. History remembered him only as the man who murdered America's greatest president. The legacy of Lincoln, his plan for a gentle, forgiving Reconstruction, died with him. In the years that followed, bitterness, violence, and division plagued the South. Yet his vision endured in words and memory. He had preserved the Union. He had struck down slavery. He had proven that democracy could endure, even in the face of civil war. For generations, Lincoln would be remembered not only as a leader, but as a symbol of humility, justice, and sacrifice. Statues rose in his honor. His speeches were studied, his image placed on currency, his name etched into history. Above all, he became a moral compass, a reminder of America's highest ideals, even in its darkest hours. Closing reflection, Abraham Lincoln's story is both triumphant and tragic. From humble beginnings in a log cabin, he rose to the presidency, steered the nation through its greatest crisis, ended slavery, and paid with his life. In the quiet of Ford's Theater, in the echo of Booth's shot, America lost more than a president. It lost a man who carried its conscience. And yet, as Stanton said, he now belongs to the ages. Lincoln's words and deeds continue to inspire, proof that leadership, when guided by compassion and principle, can change the course of history.